It's fine.
Okay, fine. So recording has started. So unless you want to be present in the recorded video, I ask you to keep your cameras off and your mics as well. If you are fine with appearing in the recording, then you may do whatever you want. Welcome to Design for Change, Active Directory for the Cloud Age, the last session for this CloudEight virtual summit for June this year. I heard that another edition is already in the making. I'm not quite sure if I can share, so I'll just leave it with that. Welcome, everyone. I think you just go ahead. Design for Change, Active Directory for the Cloud Age is what I'm going to talk about in the next 45 minutes. And I'm very glad that I have so many attendants here. And I just told the ones before the recording started, the other guests, that I'm hoping for the thunderstorm to arrive so that everybody rushes in and turns into CloudEight. So we will have a full audience here. So, okay. That's better. So why am I here on this Friday evening talking to you and telling you anything about, well, very old technology? I'm Niels Kaczynski. I live in Hanover, where I'm actually standing right now. I'm living here with 3 women, which is not quite correct anymore. One of those is my wife, and 2 of those are my adult daughters. One of those has already moved out of the house. She's at the university right now, and I'm standing in her former room. So if I forget what I wanted to talk about, I can give you some cat content as well. So I'm prepared for everything, I think. So professionally, I am the director of the Competence Center Microsoft. Sounds great, doesn't it? At ITP in Hanover, we are an IT service provider with a focus on software development, on cloud and digitalization consulting, and on security. So I've been working in IT for more than 25 years now. For almost 20 years, I've been in Microsoft MVP, so I've been around in the IT community for quite some time. And if you didn't know, I do run the German community blog, facomatic.net. If you don't know that one, feel free to get there after the session and look what we show you there. So Active Directory, isn't that really old stuff? It is. It is actually really old stuff. Active Directory started its life in the late 1990s actually. It came into the market with Windows 2000, and the first larger production domain was Microsoft's own domain in the early month of 1999. So this is when all this story started. So why am I talking about such old stuff in this shiny new cloud world? Well, basically, as we will see, Active Directory is still a matter. The attacks in the last few weeks showed us a lot about it. Hafnium attacked Active Directory once it was inside your network, using some vulnerabilities in Exchange and then going over to your Active Directory. So obviously it is a matter security-wise, but it is a matter design-wise as well, because Active Directory turns out to be the turning point of identities in most real cloud implementations. We'll come over to that in a while. And so we are still doing Active Directory consulting, actually. It's not just troubleshooting, it's actually consulting regarding the design, regarding changes in Active Directory, and regarding what should be done, what should my Active Directory do to power a cloud implementation. And people are not familiar with that. No, after more than 20 years, it is still something they wonder about. And I would like to cover some of those things in the next minutes. That's better like that. Okay, firstly, let's talk about some design basics, because Active Directory as the foundations for identities can be deployed in different ways, and there is still confusion about that. So let's get back to some of those basics. Firstly, what should I name my Active Directory? Most administrators and most consultants, when they're asked, so what should I call my Active Directory once I install it, for a new installation, maybe for a new firm, or for a firm that reinstalls their Active Directory, most of them say, well, it's simple, just take your company name. Is that a good idea? So we have a lot of those calling it domain.local with company name.local, or company name.com, .de, .whatever. So once you choose your company name as an Active Directory name, the name can never be changed afterwards. There is no way to do that, no simple way at least. You could do a migration into a new Active Directory environment, but that's actually the only way to do it, unless you are very daring and unless you have Exchange deployed. But most environments have Exchange deployed because that's one main reason to run Active Directory in the first place. So actually that doesn't mean an option. You cannot change your name afterwards. And think what happens once your company name changes. And that happens much more often than many think. Many think, well, this company has been named company and it will never change. It might change. I have done quite a lot of consulting in the recent years for customers who did change their company name, and they were really upset that their Active Directory reflected the old company name, and they wanted the new name there, and they thought it was a matter of some clicks to change it. It isn't. It is a major migration project that you have to do when you want to change your domain name. So don't use your company name if you have the choice. So the only real option that you should choose once you have the opportunity to get a new name for your Active Directory is to use an abstract name, a name that has nothing to do with your actual company name or with anything else, an abstract name that is a valid official domain that you own, that you do register just for the sole purpose of using it as an Active Directory name, because that is the only way to make sure that this is a name that really is owned by you and that doesn't need to be changed when your business changes. You can just continue using that name. If you didn't obey that rule, if your Active Directory domain is something like domain.local, or your Active Directory domain name reflects your company name, don't take that as a reason to migrate either. Just leave it as it is. It is most likely that you will never run into problems apart from cosmetical issues. But cosmetical issues should not be a reason to migrate your network, because that can very quickly be a large amount of cost to do. So stepping ahead, there are technical opportunities, there are technical options to design your Active Directory. Here in this chart, you see a very large design with multiple domains. You can actually do that. An Active Directory is comprised of domains as the core building block. Multiple domains can be arranged in a tree, and multiple trees can be arranged in a forest. So is that a good idea? Well, that depends, but mostly I think not. We'll return to that. But why isn't it? So basically, what many customers think and what Microsoft actually suggested in the early days of Active Directory, but remember, the early days of Active Directory were the late 90s. That is almost 30 years ago, was that once you choose to separate a part of your company, you could just take that company's part of Active Directory separated and run it as a separate Active Directory environment. You can't actually. You can never take a part of your Active Directory forest, separate it from the rest, and run it independently. That's technically impossible. Another idea that people have. We have multiple domains, and those domains reflect business units. And once we carve out a business unit, we make it a company of its own, we could just separate it out and they can run what they have separately, independently. The same story here. Once an Active Directory domain is a part of any larger structure, of any tree or forest, it will always be a part of that. It can't be separated, never. So another idea that people have for multiple domains, for running or designing multiple domains, is this one. We have separate business units, separate security zones in our company network, and we would like to have them separated on the domain level. So we would like to have one domain for the first business unit and security zone, the other domain for the next security zone, and so on. So we would like to have a security separation like this. No, sorry, doesn't work either, because domains are not security boundaries. An administrator that has administrative right in one of those domains is not automatically an administrator in any of the other domains, but they can easily be. And there are the so-called enterprise administrators. Those administrators have the power to do anything in any of the adherent domains of any of the parts of the network. So a domain is not a security boundary, the forest is. So this is not a valid idea either. So it turns out that the single truth for designing a good Active Directory domain structure is that the most simple design that exists, and that is a single domain. A single domain is the only valid security and design model for an Active Directory environment. Same story goes here. If you have a larger implementation, if you have a multi-domain environment, you may consider consolidating that into one single domain, but don't take that as the single reason to do so. Just keep in mind that a more complex domain model, a more complex forest structure might be tedious, might be very, very complicated to administer, and it doesn't pose any internal security boundaries. So once you have a forest, that is your security boundary. And once you have a forest with multiple domains, you have the complexity to manage for administration. So the best design to use for an Active Directory is the single domain. So looking inside the domain, you can use organizational units to build a structure inside your domain, and many administrators and many consultants just say, okay, it's a simple thing. Your organization, your OU structure, your structure of containers inside your Active Directory should reflect your organization chart. No, that's not a good idea. The OU structure is not meant to reflect your organizational structure. The OU structure is solely meant to facilitate your administration. So your administration model is what dictates your OU structure. Look at this. Many times customer ask me, what is the best or what is the OU structure for my domain, for my Active Directory environment? Well, there is not that single truth, but there is a basic principle that turned out to be a good one, and that is an object-oriented principle. So I illustrated like this. You see here two trees. Actually, it's meant to be one tree. It continues. Oh, this is the first, and this is where it continues. So put that below that. It's just a matter of the screen here. So the core idea is to have a separation of object types here. Use a separate container for service accounts, for accounts that you only use for applications. Use a container for your servers, that is the computer objects of your server machines that offer services in your network. Use a container for users, a container for groups, use a container for client computers, and then use sub-OUs to differentiate between different types of those objects. And those different types are not necessarily the organizational departments that the users work in, but there are types of users. Well, there may be managers versus ordinary people. Or in terms of servers, there may be mail servers, database servers, or whatever your administrative need is. If you have a team that cares for database servers and that mostly work on database servers, then create a container, an OU for database servers. And likewise, if you have clients in your financial department and those clients in the financial department need to be secured, they need to be protected, then put those clients into one container and protect them together. This is one major benefit of this object-oriented model, that you can use it for administration. An example like this. We have a help desk group that is in charge with managing user accounts of type 1, maybe the management of the company. Now, there is one help desk group that has to manage the user accounts of managers. And there is a different help desk group that manages the user accounts of ordinary workers. So we can differentiate it like that and give the first group administrative rights for that container, the second group for that container. Likewise, for the groups, we have one help desk group or one administrator group that is in charge with managing organizational group and a different one that manages permissions group, and so on. And likewise, for the configuration, you can use those sub-OUs, those containers, to have group policy applied to those containers. So if you have the same type of servers or the same type of clients in one folder, in one organizational unit, it's a very simple matter to just put a group policy object, to link a group policy object to that container and do nothing more. And so all of your objects are configured the same, the way that you need it and the way that is adequate here. So this is a first look at an organizational design that is object-oriented and that helps here. This kind of basic design is not the one that you would deploy in your network, but it can serve as a basis for your design work. So talking about larger environments, talking about networks that span more than one location, we have a replication system in Active Directory that has proven very, very solid and very, very performing over the last more than 20 years. You must remember that when Active Directory was designed, we were talking about modems. We weren't talking about network links that were active all the time. We were talking about modem connections between company locations that were only online some hours per day. So replication of the directory service data, of Active Directory data, was an issue those days. And this replication system that was designed in the late 1990s turned out to be very, very stable and very, very performing, unless you configure it badly. And unfortunately, it is quite easy to configure it badly, but the good point about it is you can avoid those bad practices very easily. So let's look at that. We have one domain here and 3 company locations. One is in Hanover, one is in Zurich, which is a larger town in Switzerland, and one is in Youth. I was told that Youth is the smallest community in Switzerland. I'm not even quite sure if they have something like internet over there, but let's take that as an example. 3 locations for our company, and they want to run one Active Directory here. and obviously they don't have LAN type links between their locations, so they need to do something. And this is where the replication structure goes in. We can define sites in Active Directory. One site may be Hanover, one site may be Youth, and one site may be Zurich. And these are designed to host the servers, most notably the domain controllers that run Active Directory. And these are designed as well to host the clients. So a client in Hanover, when configured correctly, knows I'm in Hanover and I have a domain controller in Hanover that I can use for authentication. The same goes for a client in Youth. They know, oh, I'm a client in Youth and I'm finding a domain controller here in Youth that I can use for authentication. So I don't need to use the WAN link to use that domain controller in Hanover, do I? No, it doesn't. Once properly configured, this runs very well. There are some prerequisites, and one of those is a proper definition of subnet areas. So this must be unique. You see the subnet addresses I added here as examples. They are one-by-one relationships. So there are mostly, this would be enough to configure your network correctly so that a client in Zurich uses the domain controller on its own location and doesn't try to reach the domain controller over the WAN link in a different location. Very pretty. Do not do some special things. One of those special things is if you have the idea to reuse subnet addresses from one location in a different location. So here we have the 10.10.20x network in Hanover, and some administrator thinks it's a good idea to use that same network in Zurich. No, this is not a good idea. This is the way to chaos. But actually, I have had a lot of customers who tried to do that or who did have network topologies with non-unique network addressing and trying to run Active Directory. And of course, this didn't work very well. Another thing you can do wrong is, if you can avoid it, don't put firewalls between your sites. If you do, you can actually do that. You can control network traffic between your sites with firewalls. But if you do that, you have to control both your firewall and your Active Directory. You have to do a lot of configuration and be prepared to have your network team and your help desk in place so they can troubleshoot this really, really weird things that can happen once you have firewalls between your sites. So if you can avoid, please do avoid. Another thing to avoid is don't try to tie your clients by any additional measure, by any manual measure or whatever, to a certain domain controller. Use the Active Directory site definition and the Active Directory network topology to control authentication traffic. Don't try to tie clients to a special domain controller, because this is the basis of very, very weird issues that will take days or weeks to troubleshoot. Okay, the next one. Once we have those design basics done, we should talk a little bit about security. There has been a major change between the late 90s and now. In the late 90s, or even in the Windows 2000 timeframe, a security attack was something abnormal, was something that wasn't kept wasn't taken into account, and nobody was really thinking, well, I'm going to be attacked. Nowadays, attack is the normal matter. So this is what our design should reflect and what we should do. And there are some things that make it very easy for an attacker to take over a Windows-based network. First of all, we have smaller company locations that have proven to be very good attack vectors, because in most smaller locations, the server rooms, the rooms in which domain controllers or database servers or mail servers or whatever are run, are not the kind of server rooms that you find in the headquarter. Sometimes they are not even locked. Sometimes a server is standing in a tea kitchen or something. An attacker has very easy work to do to get that machine physically. And what's more, in most smaller locations, work ends on Friday afternoon at, say, 3 o'clock in the afternoon and doesn't start again before Monday, 8 o'clock. And that gives an attacker a lot of time to take that machine and to take whatever attack measure they want. And once they have taken over that machine from the smaller location, they are inside your company network. And that is something that many administrators ignore. They think, well, this is just a server in my small location. That doesn't really matter. Well, if it's broken, I'll just take the new one there and get the data on. No, it is an attackable device. It has security data. It has company secrets on it, and that an attacker can use. And in most companies, those machines are very much less protected than those in the headquarters. So attacking a smaller location has been working for 20 years and is still a very good attack vector. Another one, in most real life domains, it is very easy for an attacker to get just any machine, just any his own attacker notebook, and put it as a member into Active Directory. Actually, each user in Active Directory, in a default Active Directory, default configuration, each user has the right to add up to 10 machines as members into Active Directory. They don't need administrative rights for Active Directory. All they have to do is control that machine. Just imagine I'm an attacker. I'm using my own notebook. I'm using some kind of social practices to get into that company. Maybe I'm a visitor. I'm a contractor. I'm a customer of that company, waiting in the lobby and finding some network plug, get my machine there, and it will only take me minutes in most real-life networks to get my attacker notebook into that Active Directory domain. And in most networks, it will be very easy for me to escalate my privileges from an ordinary user to a domain admin. I did a session on that. You will find it on the internet. Very easy. And this has been working for 20 years. This is not a security hole in Windows, but it is a matter of bad configuration, of bad default configuration that you didn't change. So look at that. Look at things that you think are secure, but that aren't. And another one, in most networks, this kind of attack works very well and can cause a lot of trouble. I'm some user. I have a user account. Oh, I'm trying to log on as some user. I enter any password. It is wrong. I enter another one. It is wrong. I enter another one. It is wrong. And whoop, the account is locked. Now imagine this wasn't an ordinary user account. Imagine this was the service account that your database server uses to authenticate to the domain. I'm trying to log in as SQL Server using some wrong password. I do that a number of times, and whoop, the SQL Server service account is locked. This works in most customer networks that I've seen in the last 20, 25 years. And it really drives administrators pale when I show them. And this is one thing that you should look at if you are in charge with administering an Active Directory domain. This automatic account logout policy. Most admins think it's a good idea to log out accounts when an attacker tries wrong passwords too often. And we very often we see it like this, a very small number of wrong passwords that are accepted, say 5 or say 10, but it's very rarely that it's more than that. And that means that any account, each and every account in the domain can be locked with only 5 false passwords. And it's very easy to run a script against each and every account in your domain, and each and every account in your domain is locked out in a matter of seconds. Well, that's a quite funny procedure to do. So one step further, separating roles. One basic security principle that is very much important. You should have separate accounts for separate tasks. So if you have a user account for your daily work, that user account shouldn't be allowed to do administration. You should have a separate account for your admin work, and that admin account with a crown here, the golden user account that is using administrative privileges, that account shouldn't be allowed to do everyday work. So it's a good idea not to give your administrator account an Exchange mailbox, or even not to have internet access or something. Do separate your roles once you have more than ordinary privileges inside your network. One step to do is to define roles. And to do this role definition, to actually define what kind of user has what access rights in your network. So what applications can they use? What data can they access? To find out who should be able to do what. There is one thing that administrators really don't like. They need to talk to other people in the company. They need to talk to the ones that do the work in the company. And they need to find out who should be able to do what. And from that, they could derive roles and define them as groups, or use so-called claims, which is a more flexible way to do that. We'll return to that in a few minutes. So on one step even further is using roles and role separation one step more seriously, and that is so-called admin tiering. Not only separating user roles, separating an admin user from an ordinary user, but separating different administrative tasks and administrative privileges. And the idea behind this admin tiering is that you separate your network into different tiers and give your administrators only access rights to the tiers they actually need, and to have separate administrator accounts for the different tiers. The most common model is to use 3 tiers and to separate like this. The T0 tier is the identity tier. This is where your Active Directory runs. This is where your domain controllers are configured, and only the domain controllers and the systems that manage your identities, that manage administrative access and user identities in the network. Tier 1 is the application tier. This is where your application servers run, your database servers, your mail system, your application servers, your SAP systems, your whatever. This is where only servers run, no clients, no domain controller. And we have a T2 tier. This is the client tier, or as well called the access tier or the untrusted tier. This is where the client systems go, where the notebooks go, the PCs, and maybe some other systems that users work on directly. This is the least trustworthy tier because this is where user sessions run, and this is where users have some kind of access, some kind of direct access, and some kind of control. So an account that is in charge with managing client systems, that same account must not be used to access or manage systems on any of the other layers. So you have one administrator account or a group of administrator account that is in charge with tier 2. You have a separate group of accounts with separate accounts that is in charge with the application systems in tier 1, and you have a separate one that is in charge with the applications, with the domain controllers and the identity systems in tier 0. A tier 0 account must never log on to a tier 1 or T2 computer, and so on. So if you have that kind of separation, it is a very, very good preparation to prepare against greater attacks, to prepare against hafnium type attacks or the like. If you want to know more about that, here are some additions to that, so-called golden forest and red forest. I'll jump over that. If you want to know more about that, you find more information with the search term ESAE, the Enhanced Security Administrative Environment. One warning, you will find an information that this model were actually outdated, that Microsoft does no longer recommend this model of security separation. Is that true? Well, no, not really. Microsoft have found out that this model, this ESAE model, which they have propagated for a number of years, for a small number of years now, is a little bit complicated for larger network. It needs some kind of design work, and it needs very good practice in day-to-day administration. And they have found out that many customers do not cope with that. They are not able to do that level of work. So Microsoft decided to put many of the ideas into their cloud-based systems and to sell that security as a service, as cloud-based services, and to prefer those cloud-based security systems based on the same ideas here, role separations and so on, and to sell that separately as services to their customers, which is quite a good idea, actually, because Microsoft knows how to run networks and they can do a lot of great things there. But that doesn't mean that the idea as such is bad, and that doesn't actually mean that the idea is somewhat withdrawn. If you read carefully, you see that Microsoft still recommends it if your actual implementation in your local network needs such a model. So it is not outdated. It's still a good idea to do this kind of role separation. Okay, let's go one step further. What does that mean for hybrid designs, for linking cloud and local systems? First of all, identity is the new perimeter. That is what we should keep in mind here. An Active Directory is still the local anchor for your identities throughout your whole network, throughout your local network, and throughout your cloud implementation as well. Why is that? Well, let's have a look at that. Still, users primarily log on in most companies, almost all companies, we can say, still log on primarily to the local domain. And that local domain is then some kind synchronized or linked in some way to an Azure Active Directory, or even to an Azure Active Directory domain services implementation. By the way, if you ever find who makes up such abbreviations as AADDS to define a core technology in one of the most important products that Microsoft has to offer, well, just tell me their name. AADDS, I find that great. So still, your Active Directory and Active Directory user accounts are what defines a user's identity. And with that account, they access the Azure resources, even if you do have a separate AADDS deployment. Basically, both Azure AD and AADDS are just very flat projections of your Active Directory structure. The full set, the full feature set that Active Directory, that Windows administration has to offer is only found in an Active Directory. So for years to come, I'm very sure that for years to come, still Active Directory will be the core of identity management in companies. Okay, what does that mean, that linking to a cloud service? Basically, in a customer-centered or in a private customer-centered world, we have cloud applications, and those cloud applications manage their own users. And for each website, for each web application, for each cloud application, you have a separate user log-on. And that is very tedious in a company perspective, because you have very little control. You have to define user accounts at different places multiple times. So it's very much easier to link your domain, to link your environment to that cloud environment and use your existing user accounts, your existing authentications to authenticate to cloud services as well. And this is what federation is about. Federation in a Windows-based world comes with some vocabulary, such as ADFS as the local system that manages that kind of authentication and federation on your side, on the customer side, and words like SAML, OAuth, and OpenID on the cloud side. Those are technologies that work together to make this work, to have an account from your local Active Directory log on to a cloud service that exists in the cloud. How does that work? Basically, the process is as follows. We have a user here. That user uses his computer and wants to access some cloud service. Say they want to use something in Office 365 or Microsoft 365, want to use some service, and so they need to log on to the Azure ID. So a user calls the website of that cloud service, and the website notices, oh, that user has not authenticated yet. So I'll tell that machine, well, go and authenticate first. I need to know who you are. That happens in the background. The browser, the machine, the client user's machine, then redirects to the local domain and asks, may I please authenticate? And this is what happens in the local environment. They authenticate against their Active Directory domain controller using their usual ordinary company Windows password, and go back to the machine and say, okay, you're logged in. Here is your authentication ticket, called a token, not a ticket. Here is your authentication token that you can use to prove to that cloud services that you're authenticated. And this is what happens. The client computer sends that token over to the cloud service. The cloud service checks it and finds out, okay, that is trustworthy, and I accept this user to be authenticated. So this all is about trust. That cloud service provider needs to trust their customer that they have set up all this mechanism properly. They have a contract signed before they can actually do that. And I, as a user, I have to trust both my company and the service provider that they do this whole thing correctly. There is a lot that can go wrong, and it is all about trust. So once this trust is established, a user and the authentication has been done, a user can use different services and different resources, and that is depending on what groups they are in or what is known about that user. And we can classically do that with groups in our Active Directory environment, classical Windows groups that users are members of, or we can use so-called claims, that is attribute values that describe what a user is. He could be part of the sales department and thus access the CRM deployment in the cloud or something like that. If you use claims, claims are not groups actually, but they are only attributes, mostly text attributes in your Active Directory. Very, very flexible, very easy to use in access rules, but make sure that you protect the access to those claims, to those values in Active Directory, so users cannot forge it and get access they shouldn't have. Okay, design for change. And by that, I don't mean a pocket full of change. I mean the change that we believe in. In this shiny cloud world, which is actually not quite a shiny new world anymore, but it's a lot younger than the Active Directory world. In this cloud world, everything is about change. When Active Directory came out 25 years ago, or a little more than 20 years ago, Microsoft said, do plan for a time scope of 5 to 7 years. have your design so it runs for 5 to 7 years. 5 to 7 years in a cloud world, that is an eternity. We are talking about weeks until something changes. And your Active Directory should make that possible. First of all, when you plan your cloud implementation, make sure you have a good naming concept. You have a good namespace ready. That is the naming format that users use to log on. I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'm going to do that quite quickly. Make sure that you have a domain that you can use to connect your users to the cloud, so they are recognized as who they are. If you don't have that, go and register one, at least do some planning ahead. So the next one is, don't try to use your Active Directory as a central data store. This is an outdated idea that stems from the 1990s. In those days, people thought it would be a great idea to have one central directory services that tells us everything about our network. But in those days, networks weren't tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of users. They consisted of a small number of users, small number of devices, and that number of information, that amount of information was never the same as it is now. If you want to store information about anything in your network, about your assets, do identify where that information lives best. Active Directory is very seldom the place where you should put that information. Refrain from adding information into Active Directory that doesn't belong there. So your identities are defined by multiple sources, local accounts, local permissions, local settings, or whatever. And your identities are used in different places. Make sure that you have the right information in the right place. And the best thing to do that is to deploy some kind of turntable between that. A data turntable. Use your information where it lives best. Go and have separate data sources and have something in between that links that information and is able to process that information the way that the systems need. So that is, identity management systems have a very vital role in this modern cloud world. Do consider that. And if you do, it's not only identity management, it's as well having processes in place to tidy up your implementation, to clean up old data, and to have an identity lifecycle in place. Okay, and then as the last one before I'm letting you out into the night, let's have a look at emergency. Still, after more than 20 years of operations with Active Directory, still most administrators that I talk to have no idea what to do in case of an emergency. So if you're one of those, look at this. Most emergency planning is done in a very bad way, because most emergency planning goes out from a very simple idea. What do I have to do if I have lost everything? Well, if I have lost everything, nothing is left, actually. Nobody can work. Maybe this is the worst scenario that you can think of. And maybe you have the idea that if you solve that worst scenario that you can think of, everything is solved. No? Nothing is worse than this worst scenario, so everything is included. Is it? No, it is not. Solving everything lost scenario is actually quite easy if you do have a backup. Most people do have backups nowadays. The quality of those backups may be a different story, but most users, most people, most admins have backups in place. And it is very easy to restore something that nobody works with. Now, nobody disturbs you. You don't have to wait for anybody because nobody's working anyway. But that is not an interesting story. The more interesting story is one domain controller is lost, or multiple domain controllers are lost, or much more frequently, a group is lost. I have accidentally deleted a user account. The rest is still working. So you may agree this is not the kind of worst case scenario that I've been talking about before, but this is a small problem that turns out to be a huge problem in most companies because the admins don't know what to do. So here's what you should prepare. First, design your environment to prevent emergency. Keep it simple. Don't deploy things just because you deploy them. Keep track record of your Active Directory configuration, such as the FSMO role assignment. Keep a documentation. Don't use multifunction servers. Don't use your domain controllers to do any other kind of service. Don't install a SQL server on your domain controller, for example. And don't just put administrator accounts, put anything on systems that shouldn't belong there. Keep things simple. That is the best way to prevent emergency. So, and how to backup an Active Directory? First of all, do multiple backups. Backup more than one domain controller. And keep a text export of your Active Directory with your backup. Because if you run into the issue that you have accidentally deleted a user account, you may want to restore that user account. But what was the name of that account? You can't look it up because you have just deleted it. Imagine it wasn't one, it was several hundred accounts that you just deleted. How were their names? It's a good idea to have a text export of your Active Directory with your backup so you can look things up. Do switch on the Active Directory recycle bin to just recover accidentally deleted objects. And the primary Active Directory backup should be done with Active Directory board tools, that is Windows Server backup and the system state backup. This should always be your primary backup. It is not a beautiful one. Veeam is much, much more beautiful. XYZ is much, much more beautiful than Windows Server backup and system state backup. But Windows Server backup is the only backup tool that will be supported end-to-end by Microsoft. So if the case comes and your shiny other backup tool doesn't work for some reason, you still have an additional backup with board tools that Microsoft will support. That's a great idea. And if you do want to use a different backup method, feel free, just do it. They will probably be better, but do both. Do both. Don't just use one, do both. Okay, here is the cheat sheet. So if you didn't just want to look up this graphic thing and note anything, here is the same thing again in text. You will, of course, be able to download this slide deck afterwards. So, and practice. I really do mean it. Do practice your recovery. Do practice the emergency. Do practice recovering a user from the so-called tombstone. Do practice recovering a domain controller from your backup. Do practice recovering your whole domain structure, as complicated as it may be, from your backup. You will find out that it is more complicated than you thought in the first place. The more complex your environment is, the more pitfalls there are. Even long-year experts in Active Directory may run into pitfalls when restoring an environment for a customer that they haven't practiced. You will need time to do that, and you should practice. Really, I mean it. Okay, food takeaway. This is what we have been talking about. I have been, well, about 10 minutes late now, but I think we are still in time. And this is those that we owe thank to. And I thank you for listening to me on this Friday evening. I find that there is an audience back in in the backyard. And I wish you a very nice weekend. Thank you.